Question is that a respectful address be presented to His Excellency the Governor-General in reply to His Excellency's speech.
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Annette King.
Mr Speaker, I move that the following words be added to the address. And expect over the next 3 years to see every child grow up in a warm, dry home, the number of affordable homes built increased, every New Zealander have access to affordable health care, wages for all rising faster than the cost of living, jobs created and unemployment back under 4%, exports increased as a percentage of GDP, the economy diversified towards value-added goods and services, economic and social inequality reduced, targets to measure and reduce child poverty, a cross-party approach to addressing domestic and sexual violence, real measures to target climate change and improve our sustainability, a plan for the recovery of Canterbury, and the government to be guided in their work by the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Because without these commitments and goals, New Zealand will not grow or move forward to the future New Zealanders deserve. Mr Speaker, can I begin by congratulating you on your re-election as Speaker? And it seems to me that you took on the role somewhat reluctantly initially, but you've grown to enjoy the job, and perhaps it's the liberation from the interminable National Party caucus meetings that has seen a spring in your step and a twinkle.
Order, I couldn't possibly comment.
A spring in your step, Mr Speaker, and a twinkle in your eye. But for the opposition over the next 3 years, we have one expectation from you: relentless fairness. As Victor Hugo wrote, being good is easy. What is difficult is being just. We want both, good and just. And I will be on hand to offer you unsolicited advice, whether you need it or not, and I'm sure I will receive your standard response. Congratulations to Chester Borough Deputy Speaker and his two assistants, Lindsay Tish and Trevor Mallard. Trevor, I have no doubt you will be just, but the challenge is to be good. Congratulations to all the newly elected members of Parliament. It's a terrific honour to represent New Zealanders in this House, and a great responsibility as well. And welcome back to all the returning members of Parliament from all sides of the House. It was a long, hard-fought campaign, but the reward is the privilege of serving our country as their elected representatives. I would like to particularly recognise the new and returning Māori members of Parliament. The silver lining for the Labour election was the return of 6 of the 7 Māori seats to Labour. And there's been a significant vote of trust in Labour by Māoridom, and we will ensure that that trust is not misplaced by doing all we can to advance their aspirations. And this is a good opportunity to acknowledge the National Party's change of heart on the retention of the Māori seats. In the end, National usually comes round to Labour's policies. Nuclear-free New Zealand, working for family, interest-free student loans, Kiwi Saver, Cullen Fund, I could go on. Mr Speaker, I'd also like to congratulate the members of Parliament elected in Canterbury. There's a lot of work ahead of you and for the people of the region, and I wish you the very best on your endeavours on their behalf, and be assured of Labour's support over the years ahead. And finally, congratulations to the Prime Minister on your party's fine victory at the election. Securing a third term is not an easy feat, and you have achieved it. Of course, with it comes huge responsibility. No longer in your 7th year in government can, when things go wrong, be blamed on Helen Clark's government. Or even, Mr Speaker, on poor old Mickey Joseph Savage. It is time for the government to step up, time to own their decisions, and it's time to take responsibility. The result of the election from a Labour perspective was not what we hoped for. Voters have given us a message, and the measure of our party will be how we pick ourselves up take the advice of New Zealanders on board and return to represent them in a manner that reflects their aspirations and needs. Mr. Speaker, we are pleased that we have won a seat on the United Nations Security Council. It is a significant result and builds on the great reputation we have in international relations. It reflects a decade of hard work started by Helen Clark and Phil Goff and concluded by John Key and Murray McCully. International relations has always been an area of policy that Labor strongly believes in. When the United Nations was first formed, the then New Zealand Labor Prime Minister Peter Fraser said in San Francisco in 1945 that members of the organisation undertake, quote, to preserve, protect and promote human rights and fundamental freedoms, and in particular the rights of freedom from want, freedom from fear and freedom of speech. And I commend those words to this government because they are just as relevant today as they were in 1945. It is significant to secure a seat on the Security Council, but at the end of the day, that was about numbers. Now it's about how we use that position. And we must stand firmly on the commitments we gave when seeking that privilege, and that is to be the voice of small nations. Mr. Speaker, like many New Zealanders, we are concerned at the haste in which we're being led into conflict, where we don't know what our involvement will be, what the outcome will be, and what the exit strategy is. And like many New Zealanders, we don't feel the case has yet been made to us to be involved in a conflict with ISIS. The Prime Minister's response to serious questions from the public, from the media, and the opposition is too casual. It's too evasive, and it feels like we're being fitted out for a decision that is already made. Any decision must be considered and debated thoroughly, not rushed through glibly in a climate of claims about domestic beheadings or security tidbits dropped by the Prime Minister at media stand-ups. It is reprehensible to use fear as a weapon to persuade the public. It can lead to seeds of doubt in the trust that is placed in the Prime Minister unless that is backed up. And trust is lacking at this point. And it is self-inflicted by the Prime Minister. His comments at the meeting, Mr. Brownlee, in Washington last week, that it was just a regular routine meeting was demonstrably untrue. It was at odds with international reports. It was at odds with defence personnel. It was at odds with even President Obama. And in fact, the meeting has been described as a gathering of coalition members to plan a strategy against ISIS in Iraq. And some of us do remember the gung-ho approach of John Key in 2003 and his insistence that we send troops to Iraq, something the Labor government refused to do without a UN mandate, which never came. And the Prime Minister keeps hinting of action, including troops on the ground, something he said before the election would not happen. He's also stated that a decision on New Zealand's involvement is weeks away. If a decision is weeks away, Prime Minister, it gives us plenty of time for that decision to be made by this Parliament and not by the Executive. This House must be provided with the same briefings that the Cabinet receives. Any decision that involves New Zealanders, puts them in harm's way or this country in harm's way, must be done in an open and transparent way. And Labor is determined to take the debate to the government on this and all other fronts. We have to do that because we believe that this government has already shown that it needs to be held to account. Since being re-elected, John Key has made some big promises, and he made them again today. He said he will tackle child poverty, that he will address the housing crisis, that he will improve wages, create more jobs, and create more health services and access to education. Mr. Speaker, these are all laudable goals. They are admirable sentiments, and they need to be backed up by a real plan of action. Let's take housing. For almost 6 years, the national government ignored the growing housing crisis, particularly in Auckland and somewhat in Christchurch, denigrating those who raised the issue in this House and outside. And a year out from the election, their polling told them it was a real issue for New Zealanders, and a series of sticking plaster solutions were slapped in place. To date, the result, Dr. Smith, has been 5 new houses built in Auckland in their so-called housing accord zones. We have heard plenty from the government on addressing this issue, plenty of talk and no action. And splitting responsibility of housing between 3 portfolios and 3 ministers isn't doing something, it's spreading the blame for doing nothing. It's a housing policy by committee. The Kiwi dream of home ownership is fast disappearing under this government, and while the crisis creeps further and further into the housing market, driving up rents and mortgages, what does this government decide to do? It decides to sell off billions of dollars of state houses with no guarantee the resources will go back into social housing. In many cases, they will simply end up as expensive private rentals or sold to agencies that will struggle to meet the cost of managing them. And Mr. Speaker, the Salvation Army is held up as an example of such an agency, but they have already said they are not ready to take on a large number of state houses. So Bill English changed tact. He said they will sell houses to anybody, not just to social agencies, but they can sell them to banks, they can sell them to investors, they can sell them to speculators. He said we can sell to anybody. That is the mantra of this government. It's a recipe for doing more harm for those who are at the bottom of the housing market. And their latest announcement on housing to privatise tens of thousands of state homes, I have to tell the government, has no mandate. They have no mandate. They never campaigned on it. They never gave a hint they were going to do this. But some things like the well-being of our kids and the ability to afford a roof over their heads are not nice to haves. They are part of a decent and a compassionate society. We will, Mr. Speaker, reach across this House and back policies that actually deal with these issues properly, because it is time for real solutions. And at the next election, New Zealanders will judge this government on the result of these policies. The hallmark of this government's response has been to shift the blame on everyone else. The doozy of them all being Bill English claiming local housing planning laws are responsible for poverty. With a claim as stupid as this, it is hard to take the Prime Minister seriously when he says he wishes to address child poverty, something he and his government denied for the last 6 years. Call it anything else, just don't call it child poverty. But he knows that New Zealanders care about child poverty, and MMR research in July found 80% agreed child poverty is a problem in New Zealand, and just 19% thought the government was doing enough to address it. Nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, I am an optimist, and the well-being of our most vulnerable children, I just have to be. So I'm going to offer the Prime Minister some advice, and I hope that he takes it. If he is really serious about tackling child poverty, if he really believes that making sure all our children have the food they need to grow and learn, if he really understands it's not acceptable for families trying to have raising children, 3 children on $5 a week after their rent, if he truly wants to make sure that every single child growing up in New Zealand has a chance to succeed, our chances that he himself had, if he really believes all that, he will walk the walk and he will walk the talk. He will take his aspirational statements and he will commit them to a firm target and a firm measure. And that means reducing child poverty a public service target. Right now, there are 10 such targets. They're admirable targets, like increasing the participation in early childhood education, increasing immunisation and so on. But there is no target for reducing child poverty. That needs to change, because that's what a government that actually cares about about our kids would do. It will set targets. It will take responsibility for meeting them. Make no mistake, child poverty is a shame on this government and on this nation, and Labor will hold John Key's government to account for it. We will vigorously oppose policies that make things worse for New Zealanders. We will oppose the removal of New Zealanders' rights at work. This legislation is a tragedy for every single worker who is treated unjustly and who has no legal recourse. It is a pathway to making employment even more precarious for thousands of men and women, and especially our young people in our communities. And it is a tragedy for tens of thousands who will find their incomes dropping further and further behind the cost of living and society becoming less and less fair. New Zealanders have been told that wage increases need to come from productivity gains. I have heard Mr Joyce say this many times, and I've got a question for him today that I'd like him to answer. How do we get more productivity out of 45,000 home care workers who earn close to the minimum wage? Do they hang out only half the washing of the old people when they call them? Do they only clean the toilet bowl and not the seat when they go to clean their house? How do you get more productivity out of them? Why doesn't the government face the fact that pay increases are needed now for people carrying out work that most of us would not want to do? We will oppose the weakening of environmental protections in New Zealand, and last term we offered to come to an agreement on the more benign parts of the proposed RMA changes, but the government made it clear it wants wholesale change. We will not support wholesale change. The RMA is the way in which New Zealanders have a say in what happens where they live, how their environment is treated, and what the future of their communities will look like, Dr. Smith. And I'm told that the Prime Minister has instructed his ministers to put a green tinge over their portfolio. Well, I have to say that has to be seen as a cynical political ploy rather than a genuine commitment to our environment. Mr. Speaker, undemocratic, that's a word I think we're going to hear a lot about over the next 3 years. Certainly we'll hear that word as the government continues to pervert the use of the Official Information Act. And I have to say I was astounded to hear the Prime Minister admit to gaming the system just last week. Not astounded that it happened. You only have to look how many complaints are now being made to the Ombudsman. But how many are a result of ministers and departments not complying with the law? I'm astounded that Mr Key, the Houdini when it comes to avoiding taking blame, should admit to it. Compare this to his claim when he first came into government, and maybe he's forgotten it, so I'll remind him. He said, "My style is open and transparent, and I take people with me." Well, I have to say, Mr Speaker, open and transparent is not how I'd describe his government's response to official information requests. And a good example was a report on child poverty, Prime Minister. Did the Prime Minister know that that report was hurled back for 17 months? 17 months. It took multiple complaints to the Ombudsman, and it finally gets released after the election. It wasn't withheld because there was top secrets in it, but because it was politically embarrassing. And when the Ombudsman herself says she's very concerned, then this abuse of the Official Information Act, Mr Speaker, has to stop, and this House has to censure such behaviour. And I think we will hear the words undemocratic again and again as more dirty politics are unravelled over the coming months. And the attacks of institutions and individuals who act in the public good are revealed. And I look forward, Jerry, to seeing what comes out in the dirty washing. I'm sure there's going to be some rather large items there. Political motives are going to be laid bare. The worst of it, Mr Speaker, is not about politicians being attacked. After all, we are a pretty tough breed in here. But But as Rod Oram noted in the Sunday Star Times recently, and I hear the old grunter up the back there, Morris Williamson, laughing at the name of Rod Oram. Can I say that he said something that so many New Zealanders believe, and maybe, just maybe, if you listen, you might actually agree. Well, I believe it, and I care, because he said that many people, scientists, academics, health professionals, concerned citizens have been smeared and abused by people working on behalf of the National Party. That is reprehensible. It is reprehensible. And some of it has come out of ministers' offices, and unbelievably, even some of it out of the Prime Minister's own office. And so, Mr. Speaker, as Rod Oram says, they are destroying some good people and good society. They are harming our good name as New Zealanders and our reputation, and undermining our values and our principles. Mr. Speaker, in this term of the Parliament, the consequences of this government's past actions will come home to roost, and that includes the young minister now sitting on the front row. Some of his decisions will come home to roost, particularly the decisions about the much heralded economic boom, because that economic boom is turning into an endless stream of bad news about dairy prices and manufacturing layoffs. And you know, the National Party always laughs when we talk about manufacturing layoffs and job losses. You see, they don't believe it. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, the years of health cuts are starting to show through. When you have your senior doctors, your senior members of the medical community up and leaving because there's not enough money in health, you've got a problem. And I have to say to the new minister, and congratulations, new minister, you've got to smarten up your attire. It's just really not up to scratch. You need some brighter ties and so on. But can I say to the new Minister of Health that I want an assurance from him that this country is ready for Ebola. I want this minister to assure New Zealanders we are ready for Ebola, because we have made huge cuts in public health, Minister. You will find that is correct. We have made cuts in hospital funding, and as the minister will know better than most, disease does not honour country borders. And just saying that we can hide behind the fact that Africa is many miles away will not protect New Zealanders. We want assure, Minister, don't interject, take a call, assure New Zealanders of the readiness to deal with this potential deadly disease. It is not a laughing issue, and I was a minister that had to deal with the bird flu and with SARS, and I know we have a ministry who are capable of putting together extremely good processes. So I'm saying, Minister, inform this country exactly what is in place. The Prime Minister said this week, Ebola is hard to contract. He said, you have to get it. Well, I am not sure exactly what that means, but I have to say that it is an issue that is going to face the world, and as the General Secretary of the World Health Organization has said, it is a problem across the world, not just in Africa. Mr. Speaker, we're told that the expansion, well, now I'll get on to you, Hekia, don't worry. I'm told that the expansion of charter schools is about to proceed. Charter schools are about to proceed at pace, we're told. The National Party have given a party that got fewer than 17,000 votes the role of driving through their charter school program. This program is costing 5 times as much per student as public schooling, and it is not delivering to our children. So here is the challenge, Minister. Here is the challenge. Fund every other school child to that level. Instead of cutting funding in real terms, see how our fine public health education system will run when it gets equal treatment. So, Minister, that is the challenge to you that we want to see over the next 3 years. Mr. Speaker, I have said that this government will have to account for its actions. It has got a mandate from the public to carry out some of its policies. As we know, some of them they didn't know about, but they will be held accountable for their actions. So we will lead an opposition that will not allow this government to slide out from under the problems that it creates. We will hold the government accountable, and we will fight for the right of New Zealanders to have a fair go. We ran our election campaign, Mr. Speaker, on 3 themes: on work, on home and on family. And now, Mr. Speaker, well, of course, that's very interesting, Mr. Speaker, because we've just heard from the government that they sneer and scoff at work, at home and family. Are we surprised? Are we surprised, Mr. Speaker? We will now review our policies. That is the only sensible thing to do. But I can assure this House we will not lose sight of our values or our vision, because that is why we are Labour. And this country needs a strong opposition, and we're determined to rebuild this party and to provide it to this government. And I'm sure, as Bill English sits there today with his head buried in his hands, he will recall only so well 2002. And in 2002, the National Party got 20% of the vote. And look where he is now. He's got the limo, he's got the big salary, he's got the allowance for the house. No, not at all. I've had it before. What I'm saying is this party on this side of the House can look across at the 2002 election result and say, ours is 25 and we can build on that, because that is a good base for this party to build. We remain committed to working alongside all New Zealanders to ensure that everyone who wants a job can have one, that work is secure, it is safe and it pays fairly. And, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to champion the living wage that this government scorns, and we will take seriously the concerns of New Zealanders and be ready to lead an alternative government in 2017. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. 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 The question is that the amendment be agreed to. Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Annette King deserves some congratulations. Because I tell you what, that speech lasted longer than the average tenure of a Labour leader these days.